The candles had barely settled in their holders when Margaret Ashworth said the one thing no woman in that ballroom would have dared to say out loud. "You are wrong, sir. Completely and entirely wrong." The words cut through the music and the laughter like a blade through silk. Heads turned. Fans stopped moving. A servant carrying a tray of wine nearly dropped it, because the man Margaret had just corrected, in front of nearly 200 guests, was not some minor gentleman she could offend without consequence. He was Nathaniel Rowan, the Duke of Ashcombe, and no one in London spoke to him that way. Margaret had not known who he was when the conversation began. She had simply seen a tall, cold-eyed man at the card table insisting, with maddening confidence, that the estate tenants along the eastern county were lazy and undeserving of any reduction in their rents during the hard winter. She had heard enough talk from her father's parish to know the truth. The tenants were not lazy, they were starving, and she had said so, loudly enough for the whole room to hear. The Duke's jaw tightened. His gray eyes, usually flat and unreadable, sharpened into something dangerous. "And who are you?" he asked slowly, "to speak on matters you know nothing about?" "I know a great deal more than you think," Margaret answered, chin lifted. "My father is a vicar. I have visited those same tenants you speak of, with such contempt. I have seen their empty larders with my own eyes." "Have you?" Silence. A thick, suffocating silence that seemed to press against the walls of the ballroom. Somewhere near the punch table, a young lady gasped so sharply that her chaperone had to steady her. The Duke did not answer. He simply looked at Margaret for a long moment, as though trying to decide whether she was foolish or fearless. And then he turned and walked away without another word. Margaret's cousin, Eliza, grabbed her arm so tightly it nearly bruised. "Do you have any idea what you have just done?" Eliza whispered, her voice trembling. "That was the Duke of Ashcombe. You have humiliated a duke in front of half of London." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. She had assumed he was simply a wealthy, arrogant gentleman, the kind she encountered often enough at these gatherings and cared little to impress. She had not expected him to be the most powerful, most talked-about man in the room. Her stomach twisted with a dread she had not felt in years. By the time the carriage rolled away from the townhouse that night, the story had already begun to spread. Margaret Ashworth, an unremarkable vicar's daughter with no fortune and no title, had dared to embarrass the great and untouchable Duke of Ashcombe, and she had done it without even realizing who he was until it was far too late. Nathaniel did not sleep that night. He sat by the window of his study long after the household had gone quiet, staring out at the dark garden below, replaying the moment again and again. It was not the embarrassment that troubled him. He had endured worse than a sharp tongue at a ball. What troubled him was that she had been right. He knew, somewhere beneath the years of cold discipline he had built around himself, that the eastern tenants were suffering. His steward had mentioned it more than once, and Nathaniel had brushed the reports aside, too consumed with restoring the family's reputation, after his father's disastrous final years, to concern himself with a handful of struggling farms. His father had left behind debts, scandal, and a name that made people whisper the moment he entered a room. Nathaniel had spent the last 5 years rebuilding all of it, brick by brick, with nothing but discipline and distance. He had learned, painfully, that warmth was a weakness other people exploited. So he had stopped offering it to anyone. And yet a stranger, a woman with no fortune and no fear, had looked him directly in the eye and told him he was wrong. No one did that. Not his mother, not his steward, not even his closest friends. They flattered him, or they avoided him entirely. He found, to his own quiet irritation, that he could not stop thinking about her. Margaret, for her part, spent the following days bracing for the worst. Her father, a gentle and practical man, tried to reassure her that a single evening's gossip would fade within a fortnight. Her mother was less certain. "Dukes do not forget insults, Margaret," she said, wringing her hands as she paced the small sitting room of their modest home. "And society does not forget them either. This could follow you for years." It did not take long for Margaret to understand what her mother meant. Invitations that had once come easily now arrived late, or not at all. A family friend who had promised to introduce Margaret to her eligible nephew suddenly found reasons to postpone the meeting. Whispers followed her into shops and church gatherings, the same whispers every time. "There goes the girl who insulted the Duke." Margaret told herself she did not care. She had said nothing untrue. She had defended people who could not defend themselves, and if society wished to punish her for that, then society was not worth pleasing in the first place. But at night, alone in her room, she allowed herself to feel the sting of it. She was 23, with a small dowry, and fewer prospects than most women her age, and she had just made herself the subject of every unkind rumor in London. A week after the ball, a letter arrived at the Ashworth home, sealed with a crest Margaret did not recognize. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal, certain it would contain some formal demand, perhaps even a threat. It was from the Duke of Ashcombe himself. The letter was brief, almost curt, requesting that Miss Ashworth call upon him at his townhouse, at her earliest convenience, accompanied by a suitable chaperone, to discuss a matter of some importance regarding the tenants of the Eastern estate. Margaret read it 3 times before she believed it. She showed it to her mother, who went pale, and immediately began listing every possible disaster this visit could bring. Her father, however, studied the letter carefully, and then looked at his daughter with an expression she could not quite read. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "the Duke intends to prove you wrong." "Or perhaps," Margaret said, folding the letter with careful hands, "he intends to prove me right." She did not know which possibility frightened her more. 2 days later, Margaret stood outside the grand doors of Ashcombe House, her cousin Eliza beside her as chaperone, both of them staring up at the enormous stone facade with its tall windows and carved columns. Margaret had grown up in a comfortable but modest home, and the sheer size of the Duke's residence made her stomach tighten with nerves she refused to show. "You do not have to do this," Eliza whispered, as a footman approached to receive them. "We could simply leave. Say you were taken ill." "I am not going to run from a letter," Margaret said, though her heart was pounding harder than she cared to admit. They were led through a hall lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, and into a study, where the Duke stood waiting by the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked, if anything, even more imposing in the daylight than he had at the ball, his features sharp and unreadable, his dark coat perfectly tailored to his tall frame. "Miss Ashworth," he said, inclining his head slightly, "thank you for coming." "You gave me little choice, Your Grace," Margaret replied, and immediately regretted the sharpness in her tone. Old habits, it seemed, did not disappear simply because the setting had changed from a crowded ballroom to a quiet study. To her surprise, something flickered at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but close enough to unsettle her. "No," he agreed. "I suppose I did not." He gestured for her to sit, and once she and Eliza had settled into the chairs near the fire, he remained standing, as though he needed the extra height to say what came next. "I have spent the past week reviewing the reports from my steward regarding the Eastern tenants," he said. "I find that your assessment of their circumstances was accurate, more accurate, in fact, than the information I had been given." Margaret blinked, caught entirely off guard. She had expected anger, perhaps a cold lecture on the impropriety of speaking out of turn. She had not expected an admission. "I see," she managed. "I do not enjoy being wrong," the Duke continued, his voice measured and controlled, though something beneath it suggested this admission cost him more than he let on. "And I certainly do not enjoy being corrected in front of half of London. But I would rather be corrected, and act justly, than remain comfortable in ignorance, while my tenants suffer for it." Margaret studied him carefully. There was no warmth in his expression, no charm, nothing that resembled the practiced smiles of other gentlemen she had encountered in society. But there was something honest in the way he spoke, something that made her reconsider the cold, arrogant man she had judged so quickly at the ball. "Then why send for me?" she asked. "Surely your steward could confirm the facts without my involvement." "Because," the Duke said, and here his composure seemed to waver just slightly, "you have visited these families yourself. You know them by name. You know what they need, not merely what the ledgers suggest they need. I intend to correct the situation, and I would rather do so with accurate guidance than with guesswork." It was, Margaret realized, an invitation to help him. Not an apology, not exactly, but something adjacent to one, wrapped in practicality and pride. Eliza, silent until now, glanced between the two of them, with wide, curious eyes. "I would be glad to assist," Margaret said carefully. though I confess I am surprised, Your Grace. Most men in your position would not think to ask. Most men in my position, the Duke said, have never been told so plainly that they were wrong. I found it useful in a way I did not expect. For the first time since she had met him, Margaret felt the smallest flicker of something other than dread, curiosity perhaps, or the faintest, most cautious kind of respect. She had come to Ashcombe House, expecting to be punished for her boldness. Instead, she had been asked to use it. Neither of them could have known, standing in that quiet study with the fire crackling low and the late afternoon light slanting through the tall windows, that this single conversation would become the first thread in something neither of them was prepared for. Margaret left that day believing she had simply corrected a misunderstanding about tenant welfare. Nathaniel remained behind, watching the door long after she had gone, aware of a restlessness in his chest that had nothing to do with rents or ledgers at all. Society, meanwhile, had already decided what it believed had happened between the vicar's daughter and the Duke, and the truth, as it so often does in matters of gossip, mattered very little compared to the story people wished to tell. Within a fortnight, Margaret found herself returning to Ashcombe House more often than she ever could have imagined. What began as a single visit to correct the Duke's understanding of his tenant's hardship became a regular arrangement, one that neither of them had planned, but neither seemed willing to end. Nathaniel had appointed her, informally at first, to advise on the distribution of grain and firewood to the eastern farms, and Margaret, who had spent years watching her father tend to his parishioners with too little money and too much need, found the work meaningful in a way that surprised her. Eliza accompanied her on most visits, though as the weeks passed, she began to notice something Margaret herself was reluctant to admit. The Duke, cold and unreadable to everyone else in London, seemed to soften, however slightly, whenever Margaret entered a room. His voice lost its clipped edge. His shoulders, always so rigid, relaxed by some small degree. Eliza said nothing at first, only watched, and smiled to herself in a way that made Margaret uneasy. "You are imagining things," Margaret told her one afternoon as their carriage rolled away from Ashcombe House. "Am I?" Eliza asked, arching a brow. "He asked for your opinion 4 times today, Margaret. 4 times. And he actually listened to the answers." "He listens because I know things his steward does not," Margaret said firmly. "That is all." But even as she said it, she was not entirely certain she believed her own words. The gossip surrounding the ballroom incident had not faded, despite her mother's hopeful predictions. If anything, it had grown stranger and more complicated, twisting into something Margaret barely recognized. Some of society now whispered that she had set a clever trap for the Duke, engineering the public embarrassment to draw his attention. Others insisted she was being used by him, brought into his household only to be discarded once her usefulness ended. Margaret heard both versions repeated at church, at the milliner's shop, even once from a woman she had never met, who approached her directly at a garden party simply to ask, with poorly disguised delight, whether the rumors were true. "Which rumors?" Margaret had asked, exhausted by the entire affair. "That the Duke intends to make you his mistress," the woman said, lowering her voice, as though this were a kindness. Margaret had walked away without answering, her hands clenched at her sides, anger burning hotter than embarrassment, for the first time since the whole ordeal began. She did not tell Nathaniel about the rumor. She told herself it did not matter what strangers believed, that her work with the tenants was honest and useful, regardless of what society whispered behind gloved hands. But the words lodged themselves somewhere she could not quite dislodge, and she found herself more careful, more guarded, during her next visit to Ashcombe House, as though distance might somehow silence the gossip. Nathaniel noticed the change immediately. "You are quieter today," he observed, watching her across his study, as she reviewed a ledger of tenant needs with unusual focus. "I have a great deal to consider," Margaret said, not looking up. "That is not an answer." She set down her pen and met his eyes, surprised by how easily he had seen through her. "People are saying things, Your Grace, unkind things, about why I am here so often." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of anger that was not directed at her. "What are they saying?" "It does not matter." "It matters to me," he said, and the sharpness in his voice told her he meant it. Margaret hesitated, then decided honesty was easier than pretense. "They say I am your mistress, or that I hope to become one. They say I embarrassed you deliberately, to gain your notice." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Margaret began to regret speaking at all. Then Nathaniel set down the papers in his hand and walked slowly toward her, stopping only when he stood directly across the desk. "You embarrassed me," he said, "because you were right, and because you have never once cared what the correct thing to say might be, only what the true thing to say is. I have known you 8 weeks, Miss Ashworth, and in that time you have shown more honesty than every person in my acquaintance combined. I will not have that honesty repaid with slander." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks, though whether from embarrassment or something warmer, she could not say. "You cannot silence all of London, Your Grace." "No," he agreed, "but I can make it clear where I stand." He did not elaborate further, and Margaret did not press him, though the words stayed with her long after she returned home that evening. She lay awake turning them over, trying to decide whether they were simply the words of a man defending a useful advisor, or something else entirely, something she was not yet ready to name. The following weeks brought a shift she had not expected. Nathaniel began inviting her not only to discuss tenant matters, but to accompany his younger sister, Eleanor, on outings and lessons. Eleanor was 17, bright and curious, but sheltered nearly to the point of loneliness, since their mother, the formidable Dowager Duchess Constance, preferred strict propriety over warmth. Margaret found herself drawn to the girl immediately, recognizing in her the same restlessness she herself had felt at that age, caught between the expectations placed upon her and the person she actually wished to become. "You are good for her," Nathaniel said one afternoon, watching from the doorway as Margaret helped Eleanor practice her penmanship, the two of them laughing over some small joke Margaret had made. She has not laughed so freely in a long while. "She is a delightful girl," Margaret said. "She simply needs room to breathe. Your mother keeps her rather tightly bound." "My mother believes tight boundaries prevent scandal," Nathaniel said, something bitter creeping into his voice. "She learned that lesson rather harshly, from my father." Margaret glanced up, curious despite herself. Nathaniel rarely spoke of his father, and when he did, it was always in careful, measured tones that revealed nothing. This time, however, something in his guard seemed to slip. "My father was charming," Nathaniel continued, staring out the window rather than at her. "Charming, reckless, and utterly indifferent to consequence. He gambled away half our fortune before I was old enough to understand what gambling meant. He kept company that damaged our name for a generation. And when he died, he left me a title, a mountain of debt, and a reputation I have spent 5 years trying to repair." "That is why you were so quick to dismiss the tenant's hardship," Margaret said slowly, understanding dawning. "You could not afford softness, not with so much already broken." "I could not afford anything that resembled my father," Nathaniel said, and for the first time, Margaret heard something raw beneath his controlled tone, something close to grief. "I decided long ago that warmth was a luxury I could not indulge. It made him careless. It made him weak. I would rather be cold and capable than warm and ruined." Margaret set down her pen entirely now, giving him her full attention. "And has it worked? Has the coldness made you happy?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. He did not answer immediately, and when he did, his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. "No," he admitted. "It has made me respected. It has made me stable. It has not made me happy." The confession hung between them, fragile and unfamiliar, as though neither of them quite knew what to do with it, now that it had been spoken aloud. Eleanor, sensing the shift in the room, quietly excused herself to fetch more ink, leaving Margaret and Nathaniel alone, with a silence that felt heavier than any words that had passed between them before. "I embarrassed you that night," Margaret said finally, "because I did not yet know you. I assumed you were simply another cold, careless gentleman who cared nothing for the people beneath him. I was wrong about that, even if I was right about the tenants." "You were not entirely wrong," Nathaniel said. "I built that coldness deliberately. I wore it like armor, but I find, lately, that the armor grows heavier the longer I wear it around you." Margaret's breath caught, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the space between them charged with something neither was prepared to name. It was Nathaniel who finally broke the silence, stepping back with visible effort, as though physically pulling himself away from whatever had nearly happened. "Forgive me," he said. "I should not have said that." "Why not, if it is true?" Margaret asked softly. "Because," Nathaniel said, his voice low. My mother has already chosen the woman she intends for me to marry. And that woman is not the daughter of a country vicar, however honest or however good she may be for my sister. The words landed like cold water, and Margaret felt whatever warmth had been building between them retreat sharply behind old, familiar walls. She gathered her things with careful, controlled movements, thanked him for the afternoon, and left Ashcombe House with her spine straight and her chin high, refusing to let him see how deeply his words had struck. But once she was safely inside her own carriage, alone at last, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of it, the confusing, dangerous tangle of hope and hurt that had taken root somewhere in her chest, without her permission. She had come to Ashcombe House to help struggling tenants. She had not intended to fall into anything resembling feeling for a duke who had just reminded her, quite plainly, that she would never be considered good enough to keep. Margaret did not return to Ashcombe House for 11 days. She told herself the distance was necessary, that whatever had passed between herself and the Duke in that quiet study was best left buried before it grew into something neither of them could control. She threw herself instead into her father's parish work, visiting the sick, teaching the younger children their letters, doing everything she could to keep her hands and mind too busy for thoughts of gray eyes and low, unguarded confessions. It was Eleanor who broke the silence first. A letter arrived at the Ashworth home, written in the girl's careful, looping hand, asking, almost pleading, for Margaret to return. My brother has been unbearable, Eleanor wrote. He snaps at the servants and barely speaks at dinner, and I fear it is my fault for growing so attached to your company that its absence has unsettled the whole household. Please, Margaret, will you not come, if only for my sake? Margaret read the letter 3 times, torn between the sensible voice in her head, urging caution, and the less sensible, more insistent pull toward Ashcombe House that she could not fully explain away as concern for a 17-year-old girl alone. In the end, it was not Eleanor's plea that decided her, but a visit from her father, who found her sitting by the window with the letter still in her hands. You have been unhappy for nearly a fortnight, he said, settling into the chair across from her, with the calm patience that had guided her through every crisis of her life. I have not asked why, because I suspected you were not yet ready to say. But I will ask now, does this unhappiness have anything to do with the Duke of Ashcombe? Margaret considered lying, then found she had not the heart for it. He told me his mother has already chosen a bride for him, someone suitable, someone who is not me. Her father was quiet for a long moment. And did he say he wished that were not the case? He did not need to say it, Margaret said. I could see it plainly enough. Then perhaps, her father said gently, the unhappiness you feel is not because nothing exists between you, but because something does, and you are both too frightened of the consequences to admit it fully. Margaret said nothing, but the truth of his words settled deep in her chest, impossible to argue away. She returned to Ashcombe House 3 days later, telling herself it was only for Eleanor's sake. The moment she stepped through the doors, however, and saw Nathaniel standing at the top of the staircase, his expression shifting from careful neutrality to something far more difficult to disguise, she understood that no amount of telling herself anything would change what was already taking root between them. Miss Ashworth, he said, descending the stairs with measured steps that did not quite match the urgency in his eyes. You have been away. I have had matters to attend to, Margaret said, matching his careful tone. Eleanor missed you terribly. And you, Your Grace? Did you miss me? The question left her before she could stop it, bold and unguarded in a way that surprised even her. Nathaniel stopped at the base of the stairs, studying her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. More than I am prepared to admit, he said quietly. Something in Margaret's chest loosened at the honesty of it, even as her mind reminded her of everything standing between them. She said nothing further, and neither did he. But the air between them had shifted, charged now with an understanding neither had voiced but both clearly felt. Over the following weeks, their arrangement deepened into something neither the tenant ledgers nor Eleanor's lessons could fully explain. Margaret found herself at Ashcombe House nearly every day, sometimes reviewing accounts with Nathaniel, sometimes walking the gardens with Eleanor, while Nathaniel joined them under the thin pretense of overseeing the grounds. Small moments accumulated between Margaret and Nathaniel like stones building a wall, except this wall did not separate them. It seemed, instead, to draw them closer with each passing day. He began to seek her opinion on matters that had nothing to do with tenants or estates. He asked what she thought of a book he had been reading, a volume of philosophy he had not expected a vicar's daughter to have any interest in, only to find that Margaret had read it twice and disagreed with half its conclusions, articulating her reasoning with a clarity that left him quietly impressed. He asked about her childhood, her father's parish, the small moments of her life that most gentlemen of his standing would have considered beneath their notice. Margaret found, in turn, that she began to see past the cold exterior Nathaniel wore so carefully in public, glimpsing instead a man who had built walls not out of arrogance, but out of grief and fear, a man who had never been permitted the luxury of softness, and did not quite know what to do with it, now that he had found himself wanting it. One afternoon in late autumn, as golden leaves drifted across the gardens of Ashcombe House, Margaret and Nathaniel found themselves alone for the first time in weeks. Eleanor having been called inside for a music lesson, she loudly protested, but could not avoid. They walked slowly along the gravel path bordering the rose beds, now mostly bare, the silence between them comfortable rather than strained. "I have been thinking," Nathaniel said finally, "about something you told me, weeks ago, about honesty. You said you spoke that night at the ball because you did not yet know me, and you assumed the worst." "I remember," Margaret said. "I find myself wondering," he continued, choosing his words with obvious care, "whether I have been guilty of the same assumption, in reverse. I assumed, for most of my life, that warmth led inevitably to ruin, because I watched it ruin my father. I built every part of myself in opposition to that belief, and yet you have shown me nothing but honesty and warmth since the night we met, and it has not ruined me. If anything, I believe it has made me better." Margaret stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "Nathaniel," she said, using his given name for the first time, feeling the intimacy of it settle strangely and wonderfully in her chest. "You do not have to become your father simply because you allow yourself to feel something. The two are not the same." "I am beginning to understand that," he said, stepping closer, close enough that Margaret could see the faint uncertainty beneath his usual composure, an uncertainty that made him seem, for the first time since she had known him, entirely human rather than untouchable. "Margaret, He did not finish the sentence. Whatever he had intended to say was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps on the gravel path behind them, and both of them turned to see the Dowager Duchess Constance approaching, her expression sharp with disapproval, and beside her, a woman Margaret did not recognize, elegantly dressed, with an expression of polite, calculating interest that immediately set Margaret's nerves on edge. "Nathaniel," the Duchess said, her voice carrying the particular chill of a woman accustomed to being obeyed without question, "I did not realize you had company. Lady Beatrice has just arrived to take tea. I trust you have not forgotten." Margaret watched Nathaniel's expression shift, the openness she had glimpsed only moments before folding itself carefully away, replaced by the composed, distant mask he wore for the rest of the world. It happened so quickly that she might have imagined the change entirely, had she not spent the last several weeks learning to read every subtle variation in his face. "Lady Beatrice," Nathaniel said, inclining his head with practiced politeness, "forgive me. I had not realized the hour." "Clearly," the Duchess said, her gaze flicking toward Margaret, with an assessment so cold that Margaret felt it like a physical touch. "Miss Ashworth, I did not expect to find you here again." "I was assisting with matters concerning the Eastern tenants, Your Grace," Margaret said, keeping her voice steady, despite the unease coiling in her stomach. "How diligent of you," the Duchess said, in a tone that suggested she believed nothing of the sort. "Perhaps you might excuse us now. My son has obligations to attend to." Margaret understood the dismissal for exactly what it was. She glanced once more at Nathaniel, searching his face for some sign of protest, some acknowledgement of what had nearly passed between them only moments before. But Nathaniel said nothing, his jaw tight, his eyes carefully avoiding hers, and Margaret felt something cold and heavy settle in her chest, as she offered a polite curtsy and turned to leave. Lady Beatrice, she learned later from Eleanor, was the daughter of an earl, possessed of a substantial fortune and an unimpeachable lineage, precisely the sort of match the Dowager Duchess had been quietly arranging for months. Eleanor delivered this information with visible reluctance, watching Margaret's face carefully as though bracing for some reaction she was not certain she wished to witness. "She is not unkind," Eleanor said carefully, "but she is not you, Margaret. Everyone in the household can see the difference, even if my brother refuses to say so aloud." Margaret said nothing, though the words settled painfully alongside everything else she had witnessed that afternoon. She left Ashcombe House earlier than usual that day, her mind consumed with the memory of Nathaniel's unfinished sentence, the sudden distance in his eyes the moment his mother appeared, and the quiet, sinking certainty that whatever had been building between them might not survive the weight of everything standing in its way. That evening, alone in her room, Margaret took out paper and ink, intending to write to Eliza, needing someone to confide in about the confusing tangle of hope and dread twisting inside her. But she found she could not find the words, could not fully explain even to herself what she felt or what she feared, and eventually she set the pen aside, blew out the candle, and lay awake long into the night, listening to the wind outside her window, and wondering whether the man who had nearly spoken her name with such tenderness that afternoon would ever find the courage to finish what he had started. She did not yet know that the true test of that courage was still to come, and that it would arrive not gently, but as a storm neither of them could avoid. The storm arrived less than a week later, in the form of a rumor so twisted from the truth that Margaret barely recognized herself in it. It began, as these things often did, with a servant's careless word repeated to the wrong person, and by the time it reached Margaret's ears, it had grown into something far more damaging than the original whispers about her supposed pursuit of the Duke's attention. The news story claimed that Margaret had engineered the entire affair from the very beginning. According to the version now circulating through every drawing room in London, she had studied the Duke's habits before the ball, learned of his opinions regarding the Eastern tenants, and deliberately provoked the confrontation in order to draw his notice, knowing a public embarrassment would force him to seek her out and make amends. Worse still, the rumor suggested that Margaret's continued visits to Ashcombe House had nothing to do with tenant welfare at all, but were instead a calculated campaign to secure a proposal from a duke, regardless of the damage such an arrangement would do to his family's already fragile reputation. Margaret first heard the full extent of the rumor from Eliza, who arrived at the Ashworth home pale and anxious, clutching a letter from a mutual acquaintance that repeated the story in vivid, cruel detail. "They are calling you a fortune hunter," Eliza said, her voice tight with distress. "They say you plotted the entire thing. Margaret, this is far worse than before." Margaret read the letter twice, her hands trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "This is absurd. I did not even know who he was that night." "It does not matter whether it is true," Eliza said. "You know how these things work. Once a story is repeated enough times, it becomes truth in everyone's mind, whether or not it ever happened." Margaret's mother, upon hearing the news, took to her bed with a headache that lasted the better part of 2 days, convinced that her daughter's reputation, and by extension, the reputation of the entire family, was now permanently and irreparably damaged. Margaret's father remained calmer, though even he could not fully hide his concern, aware that a scandal of this size could affect not only Margaret's prospects, but his own standing within the parish. Margaret sent word to Ashcombe House, uncertain whether Nathaniel had heard the rumors yet, uncertain even whether he would wish to see her at all, given the danger her presence now posed to his family's reputation. The response, when it came, was brief and formal, requesting only that she attend to Eleanor's lessons as scheduled, with no mention of the scandal at all. Margaret told herself this silence meant nothing, that Nathaniel was simply too occupied to address the matter directly, but the uncertainty gnawed at her nonetheless. When she arrived at Ashcombe House the following day, she found the atmosphere entirely changed. The servants who had once greeted her warmly now avoided her eyes. Eleanor, usually bright and eager, seemed subdued, glancing nervously toward the closed door of her brother's study, as though bracing for some confrontation. And the Dowager Duchess, waiting in the hall with an expression of cold, controlled fury, made no effort to disguise her feelings the moment Margaret entered. "Miss Ashworth," the Duchess said, her voice low and sharp, "I believe it is time we spoke plainly." Margaret straightened her spine, refusing to show the fear coiling in her stomach. "Of course, Your Grace. You have caused a scandal that threatens to undo years of careful work, restoring this family's reputation," the Duchess said. My husband spent his life dragging our name through mud and gossip, and my son has spent the years since his death trying to scrub it clean. I will not stand by and watch a vicar's daughter, however clever or well-meaning, undo that work through carelessness or ambition. I have done nothing to encourage these rumors, Margaret said, her voice steady, despite the anger building beneath it. I did not seek out the Duke's attention that night, and I have not sought anything beyond honest work on behalf of the tenants since. Perhaps not intentionally, the Duchess said. But intention matters little once a story has taken hold. My son has an obligation to this family, to its name, and to a match that will secure our standing, rather than threaten it further. I would ask that you consider, seriously, whether your continued presence here serves anyone's interest but your own. Margaret felt the words land like blows, each one striking somewhere she had not fully protected. She wanted, desperately, to defend herself further, to insist that her feelings for Nathaniel, whatever they had become, had grown from honesty rather than calculation. But before she could speak, the study door opened, and Nathaniel emerged, his expression unreadable, his eyes moving between his mother and Margaret with an intensity that suggested he had heard at least part of the conversation. "Mother," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "that is enough." "Is it?" The Duchess said, turning to face her son directly. "Nathaniel, you cannot possibly allow this to continue. Lady Beatrice's family has already begun asking questions. If you do not address this scandal decisively, and soon, you risk losing the match entirely, along with whatever remains of this family's reputation." Nathaniel's jaw tightened, and for a long, agonizing moment, he said nothing at all. Margaret watched him, waiting for some sign, some indication that he intended to defend her as plainly as she had hoped he might. But the silence stretched on, heavy and unbearable, and when he finally spoke, his words were not the ones Margaret had needed to hear. "I will address the matter appropriately," he said, his voice measured and distant, the same careful tone he used with strangers and business associates, a tone Margaret had not heard directed at her in weeks. "Miss Ashworth, perhaps it would be best if your visits were reduced for the time being, until the situation has settled." Margaret felt something inside her go very still, a cold, quiet devastation, settling where warmth had been building for weeks. She had expected many things from this conversation, but she had not expected Nathaniel to retreat, not after everything that had passed between them in the garden only days before. "Of course, Your Grace," she said, her voice carefully flat, refusing to let either of them see how deeply the words had wounded her. "I understand entirely." She left Ashcombe House that afternoon, without seeing Eleanor, without another word to Nathaniel, her composure holding, until she reached the privacy of her own carriage, where it finally broke entirely. She pressed her hand against her mouth to muffle the sound of her own distress, furious with herself for having allowed hope to take root in the first place, furious with Nathaniel for proving, in the end, precisely as cautious and self-protective as she had feared he might be. The following days passed in a haze of quiet misery. Margaret threw herself back into her father's parish work, avoiding the drawing rooms and gatherings where the rumors still circulated freely, avoiding, above all, any thought of Ashcombe House, or the man who had nearly spoken her name with such tenderness in the garden, before retreating so completely the moment his family's expectations reasserted themselves. Eliza visited often, bringing news of London's latest gossip, whether Margaret wished to hear it or not. It was through Eliza that Margaret learned Lady Beatrice's engagement to the Duke had not yet been formally announced, though society considered it a near certainty, a matter of weeks rather than months. It was through Eliza, too, that Margaret learned Eleanor had taken to her room for 2 full days after Margaret's abrupt departure, refusing to speak to anyone, including her own brother. "She adores you," Eliza said gently, "and I believe, whatever his mother says, the Duke does as well. I have never seen a man look so miserable while claiming everything is settled." "It does not matter how he looks," Margaret said, staring out the window at the gray autumn sky. "He had every opportunity to defend me, and he chose silence instead. That tells me everything I need to know." But even as she said it, some small, stubborn part of her refused to fully believe her own words, refused to accept that the man who had confessed his fears and hopes to her, so openly in the garden, could simply disappear behind duty and expectation, without a single word of protest. She told herself this refusal was foolishness, a lingering hope that would only bring further hurt if she allowed it to grow. And yet, night after night, she found herself thinking of him still, wondering whether his silence in that hallway had been surrender, or merely the calm before whatever decision he had not yet found the courage to make. She did not know that in the quiet of his own study, Nathaniel Rowan was fighting a battle of his own, one that would soon force him to choose, decisively and publicly, between the safe, expected life his mother had planned for him and the honest, uncertain life that Margaret Ashworth had shown him was possible. Nathaniel Rowan had spent 5 years building a life defined by control. He controlled his estates, his finances, his reputation, and above all, himself, allowing nothing to unsettle the careful order he had constructed from the wreckage his father had left behind. But in the days following Margaret's departure from Ashcombe House, that control began to unravel in ways he had never anticipated. He noticed it first in small things. The house felt quieter without her presence, though she had never been more than a visitor within its walls. Eleanor's laughter, once frequent and unguarded, had grown scarce, replaced by a sullen silence that no amount of coaxing could lift. His own work suffered as well, ledgers left unreviewed, correspondence left unanswered, his mind returning again and again to the memory of Margaret's face in the moment he had failed to defend her, the flicker of hurt she had tried so carefully to hide. He told himself, at first, that his decision had been practical. A duke could not afford scandal, and Margaret's continued presence, however innocent, had become a liability his family's reputation could not sustain. His mother's warnings echoed constantly in his mind, reminders of everything his father's recklessness had cost them, reminders of the careful, deliberate life he had built specifically to avoid repeating those mistakes. But practicality, he was beginning to understand, felt like a poor substitute for happiness. The matter came to a head one evening when Lady Beatrice arrived for what was meant to be a quiet dinner, the sort of occasion his mother had been arranging with increasing frequency, each one nudging him closer to a proposal he had not yet found the will to make. Lady Beatrice was, by every measure society valued, an excellent match. She was well-bred, accomplished, pleasant company, and utterly unobjectionable in every conceivable way. She was also, Nathaniel realized as he watched her make polite conversation across the dinner table, someone he felt absolutely nothing for beyond distant, dutiful respect. "You seem distracted this evening, Your Grace," Lady Beatrice observed partway through the meal, her tone light but her eyes sharp with quiet assessment. "Forgive me," Nathaniel said. "I have a great deal on my mind." "The scandal, I imagine," Lady Beatrice said, and something in her voice suggested she was testing him, watching carefully for his reaction. "The vicar's daughter. My mother mentioned the rumors are quite persistent." Nathaniel set down his fork with deliberate care, choosing his words carefully. "Miss Ashworth has done nothing to warrant the rumors surrounding her. She has been an asset to this household, both in matters concerning the tenants and in her friendship with my sister." "How diplomatic," Lady Beatrice said, a faint, knowing smile touching her lips. "Though I confess, Your Grace, I have heard enough about Miss Ashworth to wonder whether diplomacy is truly what motivates your defense of her." The directness of the observation caught Nathaniel off guard, and for a moment he said nothing, aware that his silence was, in its own way, an answer more honest than anything he could have spoken aloud. Lady Beatrice studied him a moment longer, then set down her own utensils, her expression shifting into something more thoughtful than offended. "I will speak plainly, Your Grace, since diplomacy seems to have failed us both this evening," she said. "I have no particular attachment to you, beyond what our families have arranged between us. I would make you a suitable wife, and you would make me a suitable husband, and we would likely live a perfectly comfortable, perfectly unremarkable life together. But I do not believe, watching you tonight, that such a life is what you actually want." Nathaniel stared at her, startled by the unexpected candor. "Lady Beatrice, You do not need to explain yourself to me," she said, not unkindly. "But you might consider explaining yourself to her, before pride and duty cost you something you cannot easily reclaim." The words stayed with Nathaniel long after Lady Beatrice's carriage had departed that evening, echoing through the quiet halls of Ashcombe House as he sat alone in his study, staring at the same reports and ledgers he had been neglecting for days. He thought of his father, reckless and charming, who had let warmth and impulse guide him straight into ruin. He thought of himself, cold and controlled, who had let caution and duty guide him straight into a life he did not actually want. Perhaps, he realized slowly, the answer had never been choosing between the two extremes his father's failures had taught him to fear. Perhaps the answer had always been finding the narrow, difficult space between them, where honesty and responsibility could exist together, rather than in constant opposition. He rose from his desk before he had fully decided what he intended to do, moving with the same restless urgency that had once driven him to seek Margaret out after their disastrous first encounter at the ball. It was late, far too late for a proper visit, but Nathaniel found he no longer cared for propriety in the way he once had. He needed to see her. He needed to say, plainly and without the careful distance he had hidden behind for weeks, exactly what he felt. He arrived at the Ashworth home just as the last candles were being extinguished for the night, and it was Margaret's father who answered the door, startled to find the Duke of Ashcombe standing on his doorstep at such an hour, his expression unusually unguarded. "Your Grace," the vicar said, glancing past him toward the empty street. "This is an unexpected visit." "Forgive the hour," Nathaniel said. "I would not have come if the matter were not urgent. I need to speak with your daughter." Margaret's father studied him for a long moment, and something in his expression suggested he understood far more of the situation than Nathaniel had explained. "She is in the garden," he said finally. "She often walks there when she cannot sleep. I will not stop you, Your Grace, but I will say this. My daughter has been hurt enough by matters of duty and reputation. If you have come only to explain yourself without offering anything more, I would ask you to reconsider knocking on this door at all." Nathaniel met the older man's gaze steadily. "I have not come to explain myself, sir. I have come to ask her forgiveness, and to offer her a future, if she will still have me." The vicar studied him a moment longer, then stepped aside, gesturing toward the small garden gate at the side of the house. Nathaniel walked through it, with his heart pounding harder than it had in years, aware that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine the entire course of his life, and hers, in ways neither of them could undo. He found Margaret standing near the low stone wall at the garden's edge, wrapped in a shawl against the evening chill, staring up at a sky scattered with stars. She turned at the sound of his footsteps, her expression shifting rapidly from surprise to wariness the moment she recognized him. "Your Grace," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "This is a strange hour for a visit." "I know," Nathaniel said. "I could not wait any longer." "For what?" Margaret asked, though something in her voice suggested she already suspected the answer and was afraid to hope for it. Nathaniel crossed the remaining distance between them, stopping close enough that he could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the guarded hope she was trying so carefully to hide. "For the courage to say what I should have said the moment my mother interrupted us in the garden. I let duty silence me that day, and it was the greatest mistake I have made since I inherited this title. I will not make it again." Margaret said nothing, waiting, and Nathaniel drew a steadying breath before continuing. "I have spent 5 years believing that warmth leads inevitably to ruin, because that is what it did to my father. I built every part of myself in opposition to that fear, until I met a woman brave enough to tell me I was wrong about something that mattered, and honest enough to keep telling me the truth, even when it cost her comfort and reputation to do so. I do not wish to live a life defined by fear any longer, Margaret. I wish to live a life defined by honesty, and I cannot imagine that life without you in it." Margaret's breath caught, and for a long moment, she simply stared at him, searching his face for any trace of hesitation. She found none. "Your mother will not approve," she said softly. "My mother has spent years mistaking control for safety," Nathaniel said. "I love her, and I will not abandon my responsibilities to this family. But I will no longer allow her fear to dictate my happiness, nor yours." "And Lady Beatrice, the match your family has been arranging?" "There will be no match," Nathaniel said. "There was never anything between us worth risking the life I actually want." Margaret felt tears gather in her eyes, though whether from relief or lingering fear, she could not fully say. "Nathaniel, if we do this, if you choose me openly, the scandal will only grow worse. Your reputation, everything you have worked to rebuild, will survive," Nathaniel said firmly, reaching out to take her hands in his own, his grip steady, despite the risk he knew he was taking. "Reputation matters, Margaret. I will not pretend otherwise. But it matters less to me than honesty, and it matters far less than you. I am prepared to risk whatever remains of my standing in society to make my intentions known publicly, plainly, and without apology. I only need to know whether you are prepared to risk your own reputation alongside mine, knowing the road ahead will not be easy." Margaret looked up at him, at the sincerity in his eyes, the vulnerability he had kept so carefully hidden until now, and felt the last of her guarded hesitation give way to something steadier, something that felt very much like certainty. "I have already risked my reputation once, simply by speaking the truth in a crowded ballroom," she said, a small, unsteady smile breaking through her tears. "I find I do not regret it, nearly as much as everyone warned me I would." Nathaniel's expression softened into something Margaret had never seen from him before, open and unguarded, and entirely without the cold distance that had once defined him. "Then will you allow me to risk everything else, Margaret Ashworth? Will you allow me to claim you, openly and completely, whatever the cost?" Margaret's answer came not in words, but in the way she closed the remaining distance between them, resting her hand against his chest, as though testing whether the moment was truly real. "Yes," she said finally, her voice steady, despite the tears still gathered in her eyes. "Yes, Nathaniel, I will." Neither of them yet knew how difficult the coming weeks would prove, how fiercely the Dowager Duchess would resist, how loudly society would whisper, once the truth of their engagement became known. But standing together in the quiet garden beneath a sky full of stars, both of them finally free of the fear and duty that had kept them apart, none of that seemed to matter nearly as much as the simple, steady certainty of having finally chosen honesty over caution, and each other over everything else. News of the Duke of Ashcomb's intention to marry Margaret Ashworth spread through London faster than either of them had anticipated, and precisely as fiercely as Nathaniel had warned. Within days, the story of the vicar's daughter, who had once embarrassed the Duke at a ball, and who now stood poised to become his wife, had become the most discussed scandal of the season. Some called it romantic, many more called it reckless, foolish, and beneath the dignity of one of the oldest titles in England. The Dowager Duchess Constance did not accept the news quietly. She summoned Nathaniel to her private sitting room the very morning the engagement was announced, her composure cracking in a way Margaret had never witnessed, though she heard of it later through Eleanor, who had listened from the hallway with her hand pressed against her mouth. "You are throwing away everything I have worked to rebuild," the Duchess had said, her voice shaking with a fury that barely concealed the fear beneath it. "Your father destroyed this family's name through recklessness, and you would do the same through sentiment." "I am not my father," Nathaniel had answered, his voice steady, despite the difficulty of the confrontation. "My father destroyed this family through carelessness and indifference to consequence. I have chosen Margaret with my eyes fully open to every consequence that follows. That is not recklessness, Mother. That is courage, which is precisely what you always told me my father lacked." The Duchess had no immediate answer for that, though her disapproval did not vanish overnight. She retreated instead into a cold, wounded silence that lasted the better part of a fortnight, refusing to acknowledge Margaret whenever their paths crossed within the household, refusing even to discuss wedding preparations that the rest of the family had already begun. Margaret, for her part, bore the weight of society's judgment with a steadiness that surprised even herself. She had already endured months of whispered rumors and cruel speculation, and she found, somewhat to her own relief, that having Nathaniel beside her, openly and unapologetically choosing her, made the remaining gossip far easier to bear. Where once she had walked into drawing rooms bracing for unkind glances, she now walked in with her chin lifted and her hand resting confidently on the arm of a duke who made no secret of his devotion. Not everyone remained unkind. Lady Beatrice, to Margaret's genuine surprise, sent a brief but gracious letter shortly after the engagement was announced, wishing them both happiness and confessing, with dry humor, that she had never had any particular wish to marry a man so plainly in love with someone else. Eliza, delighted beyond words, threw herself into wedding preparations with an enthusiasm that occasionally overwhelmed Margaret entirely, and Eleanor, perhaps happiest of anyone in the household, declared to anyone who would listen that Margaret would soon be her sister in truth, not merely in affection. The true test of the engagement's strength came nearly a month later, at a grand ball hosted by one of London's most prominent families, an event Nathaniel and Margaret both understood would serve as their first true public appearance as an engaged couple. Margaret had dreaded the evening for weeks, aware that many of the same guests who had witnessed her original embarrassment of the Duke would be present, watching closely for any sign of weakness or regret. She need not have worried quite so much. Nathaniel remained close beside her throughout the evening, introducing her not with hesitation or careful diplomacy, but with open, evident pride, correcting anyone who dared speak of her with anything less than the respect she deserved. When one particularly bold matron attempted to needle Margaret about the circumstances of their original meeting, hoping perhaps to provoke some embarrassment or discomfort, Margaret simply smiled and answered with the same honesty that had started this entire journey. "Yes, I did correct the Duke, rather publicly that evening," she said, her voice carrying easily enough for those nearby to hear. "I was right, as it happens, and he was gracious enough to admit it. I find that far more admirable than any amount of practiced charm." Laughter rippled through the small crowd, and Margaret caught Nathaniel's eye across the circle of guests, watching the pride and affection in his expression, with a warmth that settled deep and steady in her chest. Whatever remained of society's disapproval could not touch the certainty she felt in that moment, standing beside a man who had risked everything, quite deliberately, to claim her. The wedding itself took place on a crisp winter morning, in the small parish church where Margaret's father had served for nearly 30 years. It was, by the standards of most ducal weddings, a modest affair, held not in some grand London cathedral, but in the humble stone building where Margaret had grown up, attending services every Sunday of her life. Nathaniel had insisted on the arrangement himself, telling Margaret privately that he wanted their marriage to begin exactly as their courtship had, rooted in honesty rather than spectacle. The Dowager Duchess attended, though her expression throughout the ceremony remained carefully composed, revealing little of what she truly felt. It was only afterward, during the small gathering that followed, that Margaret found herself alone with the older woman, for the first time since the engagement had been announced. "You have cost me the match I spent years arranging," the Duchess said, though her voice lacked the sharp edge it had carried during their earlier confrontations. "I know," Margaret said carefully. "I am sorry for the difficulty this has caused you, truly. But I did not set out to take anything from your family, Your Grace. I only ever wished to help the people who needed it, and somewhere along the way, I found myself falling in love with your son." The Duchess studied her for a long moment, something unreadable shifting behind her carefully guarded eyes. "My husband once made me a great many promises," she said finally, her voice quieter now. "Promises of devotion, of steadiness, of a life free from the recklessness that had defined his youth. He broke nearly every one of them, and I spent the years since, trying desperately to ensure my son never repeated his failures. I see now that in doing so, I very nearly forced him into a different kind of unhappiness altogether." Margaret said nothing, sensing the older woman needed the space to continue without interruption. "Nathaniel has never once, in all the years since his father's death, looked at anyone the way he looks at you," the Duchess continued. "I have spent months resenting that look, believing it a weakness rather than a strength. I am beginning to understand I may have been wrong." It was not, Margaret understood, a full apology, nor a complete acceptance, but it was, for a woman as guarded and wounded as the Dowager Duchess, as close to reconciliation as she was likely to offer, and Margaret accepted it with the same grace she had shown throughout every difficulty of the past several months. That evening, as the wedding celebrations wound down and the guests began to depart, Margaret found herself alone with Nathaniel in the quiet garden of Ashcombe House, the same garden where he had once asked for the courage to claim her openly, whatever the cost. Snow had begun to fall softly, dusting the bare rose bushes and settling on the stone path beneath their feet. "Any regrets, Duchess?" Nathaniel asked, using her new title for the first time, with a teasing warmth that made Margaret laugh despite the cold. "None," Margaret said, leaning into him as his arms settled around her shoulders. "Though I confess, I never imagined that embarrassing a duke at a ball would lead me here." "Neither did I," Nathaniel admitted, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Though I find I am profoundly grateful you did. You saved me from becoming a man I never wished to be, Margaret. You saved me from my father's mistakes and my own fear, all at once. And you," Margaret said softly, "risked everything to claim a future neither of us was certain we deserved. I would say that makes us rather evenly matched." Nathaniel smiled, the last remaining traces of the cold, guarded man she had first encountered at that fateful ball entirely gone, replaced by someone open, warm, and unmistakably happy. Together they stood in the softly falling snow, no longer the scandalous vicar's daughter and the untouchable duke that London's gossip had once made them out to be, but simply Margaret and Nathaniel, two people who had chosen honesty over caution, and love over fear, and found in that choice a happiness neither of them had believed themselves capable of finding. The scandal that once threatened to define them both eventually faded, as scandals always do, replaced by newer gossip and fresher stories for society to chew over. But among those who had watched the story unfold from its very first moment, in that crowded ballroom where a fearless young woman had dared to tell a duke he was wrong, the tale of Margaret and Nathaniel Rowan remained a favorite, retold for years afterward, as proof that sometimes the very thing that seems most likely to ruin a person is, in fact, the thing that finally sets them free. A year passed, and with it came changes neither Margaret nor Nathaniel could have fully predicted on that snowy evening in the garden. The Eastern tenants, once the subject of their very first disagreement, now thrived under a system of fairer rents and better support that Margaret had helped design from the very beginning, a system other landowners in the county had slowly, grudgingly begun to study and imitate. Nathaniel found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, developing a reputation not for coldness or distance, but for fairness, a reputation Margaret often teased him about, reminding him gently that it had taken a rather public embarrassment to set him on that path. Eleanor, now 18, and blossoming under Margaret's continued guidance, had grown into a confident young woman, with none of the anxious restraint that had once defined her. She had recently caught the attention of a quiet, thoughtful gentleman from a neighboring estate, a man who seemed to appreciate her intelligence and curiosity rather than wishing to smother it, and Margaret found great satisfaction in watching the girl she had once comforted through loneliness, now stepping confidently into her own future. The Dowager Duchess, though never entirely warm, had softened considerably over the months since the wedding. She visited more frequently than either Margaret or Nathaniel had expected, and though her conversations with Margaret remained formal, they had grown gradually less guarded, occasionally even touching on subjects the older woman would once have considered far too personal to share. It was, Margaret understood, its own quiet kind of reconciliation, built slowly rather than all at once, much like everything else that had shaped her life since that fateful evening at the ball. It was during a visit to the Eastern estate, nearly 14 months after their wedding, that Margaret and Nathaniel faced a challenge neither of them had anticipated, one that tested the foundation of honesty they had built their marriage upon in ways far more personal than anything society's gossip had ever managed. A severe illness swept through several of the tenant farms that winter, striking hardest among the youngest children, and Margaret, true to the instincts that had first drawn her into the tenants' lives, insisted on visiting the affected families directly, bringing medicine and comfort despite the obvious risk to her own health. Nathaniel, terrified by the prospect of losing her, argued fiercely against the visits, the first true disagreement of substance in their marriage. "You cannot ask me to sit safely at home, while children suffer within a few miles of where we live," Margaret told him, standing firm despite the worry evident in his eyes. "This is precisely the work that brought us together in the first place, Nathaniel. I will not abandon it now, simply because it has become inconvenient or frightening." "It is not inconvenience I fear," Nathaniel said, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show so openly. "It is losing you, Margaret." "I cannot lose you." Margaret softened at the raw vulnerability in his voice, understanding suddenly that his resistance came not from any desire to control her, as his mother might once have wished, but from a fear rooted in genuine love. She took his hands in hers, holding his gaze steadily. "Then come with me," she said. "Do not ask me to stay behind out of fear. Stand beside me instead, the way you did the night you chose to claim me openly, whatever the risk." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, the same internal battle she had once watched him fight, in that quiet garden playing out once more behind his eyes. But this time, the resolution came more quickly, tempered by everything their marriage had already taught him about the strength found in shared honesty, rather than solitary control. "Together then," he said finally, "we face it together, or not at all." They spent the following weeks working side by side among the tenant families, Nathaniel arranging for physicians and supplies, while Margaret tended directly to the sick, her early experience in her father's parish proving invaluable in ways neither of them had anticipated when they first began their unlikely partnership. It was grueling, frightening work, made bearable only by the fact that neither of them faced it alone. The illness passed eventually, as such crises often do, leaving behind grief for the few families who had lost loved ones, but also a deep, renewed gratitude among the tenants for a duke and duchess who had chosen to stand among them rather than retreat behind the safety of their grand estate. Word of their dedication spread beyond the county, adding yet another layer to the story London already loved to tell, transforming Margaret and Nathaniel's tale from a simple romance, born of scandal, into something society increasingly regarded with genuine admiration, rather than mere curiosity. That spring, as the estate slowly returned to its usual rhythms, Margaret discovered she was carrying their first child, news that filled Ashcombe House with a joy even the Dowager Duchess could not fully guard herself against. Eleanor declared herself the future aunt with an enthusiasm that bordered on the theatrical, immediately beginning preparations for a nursery despite Margaret's amused protests that there remained many months yet before the child's arrival. Nathaniel, for his part, approached the news with a tenderness that surprised even Margaret, who had grown accustomed over the past year to the many ways her husband had softened since their first, disastrous encounter at that London ball. He spoke often, in quiet moments between them, of the kind of father he hoped to become, determined to offer their child the warmth and honesty he himself had been denied throughout his own difficult childhood. "I do not wish our children to fear vulnerability the way I once did," he told Margaret one evening, his hand resting gently against the small, still barely noticeable curve of her stomach. "I want them to understand, from the very beginning, that honesty and warmth are not weaknesses to be guarded against, but strengths to be embraced." "They will learn that from watching you," Margaret said softly. "You have already proven it, Nathaniel, more thoroughly than any lesson could teach." Their daughter was born that autumn, on a bright, crisp morning, nearly identical to the one on which Margaret and Nathaniel had first exchanged their vows. They named her Charlotte, after Margaret's late grandmother, and from the very first moment Nathaniel held her, the household understood that whatever coldness had once defined the Duke of Ashcombe had been thoroughly and permanently replaced by a devotion so evident that even the most hardened London gossips eventually ran out of unkind things to say about the match they had once considered scandalous, beyond redemption. Years later, when Charlotte was old enough to ask about the story of how her parents had fallen in love, Margaret would tell it exactly as it had happened, without embellishment or exaggeration, because the truth, she had long since learned, needed no improvement. She would tell her daughter about the night she had corrected a duke in a crowded ballroom without knowing his identity, about the tenants whose hardship had first brought her and Nathaniel together, about the fear and duty that had nearly kept them apart, and about the courage it had taken for both of them to finally choose honesty over caution, love over safety, and each other over everything society had told them they should want instead. "Your father risked everything for me," Margaret would say, watching Nathaniel across the room as he lifted their laughing daughter into his arms, the same cold, guarded man from that first ballroom encounter, now entirely transformed into someone open, warm, and unmistakably happy. "And I have never once regretted allowing him to claim that risk, or the life we built together because of it." It was, in the end, precisely the kind of story London loved best, not because of the scandal that had begun it, but because of the honesty that had ultimately triumphed over every fear, every expectation, and every careful wall either of them had once believed necessary for survival. Margaret Ashworth had embarrassed a duke in front of all of society, and in doing so, had given him the one thing his title, his fortune, and his carefully guarded reputation had never been able to provide: a life built on truth, and a love strong enough to risk absolutely everything.